Welcome to this video presentation of NATO Reception, Staging and Onward Movement Process. After this presentation, you should be able to summarize the reception, staging and onward movement process, explain the operational documents that governing the deployment, recall the Joint Logistic Support Group responsibilities within the reception, staging and onward movement process, recall the command and control in strategic deployment and the reception, staging and onward movement phase. We have in earlier presentations briefly introduced the reception, staging and onward movement process used during deployment. National movement or homeland movement is the responsibility of the respective nations and conducted under national control. It consists of gathering personnel and all equipment at one or more ports of embarkations, normally personnel at an airport and equipment and cargo in a harbor. Strategic deployment is the movement of forces from a port of embarkation in the national country to a joint operation area. Strategic movement is a national responsibility and are deconflicted by NATO through the Allied Movement Coordination Centre. Reception. Following the strategic deployment, personnel and material will be received, offloaded, marshalled and transported from a strategic lift assets in ports of debarkations to a staging area. Personnel and material entered into the joint operation area are recorded during this stage immediately after the strategic deployment. Reception is focused on the land forces and those air and maritime force elements that do not self-deploy. Staging. Following reception, personnel and material meets in the staging area to organize, prepare and form the unit. The units will not leave the staging area before they have achieved their initial operational capability. Onward movement is the process of moving units, personnel and associated material from staging areas to their assigned area of operation. The unit should be self-sustained, included self-defense and force protection. Integration. The complexity and time required for integration depends on the size, contingency, conditions, and level of coordination and planning. Integration ends with the national transfer of authority to SACEUR. This figure depicts the main processes from national locations to the designated area of operations for deployment, and from the designated area of operations to national locations for redeployment. We will not focus on the redeployment in these presentations. Reward movement, staging and dispatch are in many ways the reception, staging and onward movement process, only backwards. Joint Logistic Support Group will plan the reception, staging and onward movement on behalf of the Commander Joint Task Force. The reception, staging and onward movement plan will build on the Allied disposition list, the Commander's required date, and the agreed multinational detailed deployment plans. The reception, staging and onward movement is conducted as an operation under control of the Commander of Joint Task Force, through the Commander of Joint Logistic Support Group, and in close cooperation with national support elements and host nations. The slide describes what the tactical units are doing during the different stages of the reception, staging, and onward movement process. We will not focus on these tasks, but on what the Joint Logistic Support Group and the national support elements have to do to support the unit's reception, staging, and onward movement process. The reception, staging, and onward movement process itself is very simple. In the home country, units are split in transportable packages, personnel, and material. Each will be transported in the most appropriate way. In the theater, these packages have to merge into serviceable units again. In this example, material arrives by vessel in the seaports of debarkation and is transported to a marshalling area. The personnel arrives by plane in the airport of debarkation. Drivers are transported to the marshalling area to pick up their vehicles and drives to the staging area. Here units will be recreated. After that, the unit will move to their final destinations. An advance party with personnel and material, included vehicles, will arrive by plane in the designated airport of debarkation. The advance party will arrive fully operational and move themselves to the final destinations. A deployment is an operation. Here we will look into those important documents that controls and prioritize the deployment. During Phase 2 in the operational planning process, Allied Command Operations, in coordination with its member nations, agree to the Combined Joint Statement of Requirement. This document contains the Joint Task Force capabilities and capacity. This document is the overall document for the operation. Allied Disposition List contains all units, types, size, and nationality that will participate in an operation. Joint Force Command is responsible for this list in coordination with the troop contributing nations. Logistics issue to the Allied Disposition List is discussed and agreed during the initial planning conference. Commander required date is the commander of Joint Task Force requirement when each of the unit on the Allied Disposition List should be ready to solve their tasks in the operation area. This list decides the order on when each unit are deployed, the strategic deployment, and the order the units are pushed through the reception, staging, and onward movement process. The outcome of the movement planning will be a multinational detailed deployment plan that are coordinated and deconflicted by the Allied Movement Coordination Centre on behalf of SHAPE to meet operational requirements and commanders' required date. The multinational detailed deployment plan is decided during the final planning conference. Each troop contributing nations are responsible for their own national deployment plan that contains the national deployment. This plan has to be synchronized with the multinational detailed deployment plan. Finally, we have the reception, staging, and onward movement plan. Joint Task Force will coordinate and deconflict all units through the reception, staging, and onward movement process to meet their commander required date. Joint Logistic Support Group will, on behalf of the Joint Task Force, execute the reception, staging, and onward movement process for all units. Before we look into the Joint Logistic Support Group's tasks during the reception, staging, and onward movement phase, we would emphasize the importance of two elements. Medical evacuation plan for the reception, staging, and onward movement phase. Not only for those Joint Logistic Support Group units that carry out the reception, staging, and onward movement, but also for those tactical units that are assembled, organized, and resupplied as units during the reception, staging, and onward movement phase. This evacuation plan has to be operational until the Joint Task Force medical facilities have reached fully operational capability. During logistic planning, prior to the deployment of the Joint Logistic Support Group, it is important to identify the need of material handling equipment at all locations where cargo or material needs to be transferred from one mode of transport to another. This slide lists the most common tasks for Joint Logistic Support Group at an airport of debarkation. Please look closer into the text on the slide. Here we have listed the most common tasks for Joint Logistic Support Group at the seaport of debarkation. Please look closer into the text on the slide. Here we have listed the most common tasks for Joint Logistic Support Group in the staging area. Please look closer into the text on the slide. Even if onward movement is a joint logistic support task, the tactical units have their own tasks and requirements. Joint Logistic Support Group and each tactical unit has to coordinate and agree on the plan and execution of the onward movement. Command and control. Clearly articulating responsibilities is the first step in fully synchronized and coordinated operations supporting the range of military operations. The troop contributing nations will not execute and implement transfer of authority of own tactical units to NATO before the units are in the integration phase. Supreme Headquarter Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, has the command and control of the strategic deployment of the forces and coordinate with both troop contributing nations and host nation. Allied Movement Coordination Centre will execute the strategic deployment on behalf of SHAPE. Joint Task Force takes over the command and control of the deployment when the troops and equipment arrives the designated port of debarkation. Commander of Joint Logistic Support Group are authorized by the Commander of Joint Task Force to execute tactical control of all tactical forces during the reception, staging, and onward movement process. During deployment, a direct link will exist between the Joint Logistic Support Group headquarters and SHAPE J4/Allied Movement Coordination Centre for exchange of strategic deployment information. Joint Logistic Support Group will coordinate the reception, staging, and onward movement process with national support elements, host nations, and contracted agencies that will support with logistics resources during the operation. A node is a delimited area where a logistics activity is carried out, example, in a seaport of debarkation, a staging area, or a theater logistic base. Joint Logistic Support Group is not a battle space owner, but is responsible for movement coordination inside the battle space owner's area of responsibility, also called movement control. Conflicts between operational requirements and tactical concerns between the Joint Logistic Support Group and the battle space owner are deconflicted at Joint Task Force headquarters level. Commander of Joint Logistic Support Group execute operational control over assigned own forces, multinational integrated logistic units and multinational logistic units, medical units, petroleum units, military engineering units, supply units, transportation units, and own force protection units. Joint Logistic Support Group's units will be under tactical control by the battle space owner when outside Joint Logistic Support Group's nodes. Commander, Joint Logistic Support Group may be granted tactical control of transition units not under operational control by NATO when at Joint Logistic Support Group nodes. Battle space owner will have tactical control outside the Joint Logistic Support Group nodes. It is the Joint Logistic Support Group and its units that will conduct the reception, staging, and onward movement process in the joint operation area. These units and those other units that will support Joint Logistic Support Group in their reception, staging, and onward movement tasks has to deploy and arrive the joint operation area before any logistic support is ready or available. In general, there are 3 different units that will arrive before the reception, staging, and onward movement process can be operational. It's important that also these units and their need of logistic support is coordinated between Joint Task Force, Commander Joint Logistic Support Group, respective national support elements, and host nations prior to the initial deployment. Joint Logistic Support Units. The units inside the Joint Logistic Support Group will deploy with fully self-sustainment logistic capacity. If needed, these units will be supported by host nations until the Joint Logistic Support Group is operational. Initial security forces. The initial deployment of high readiness forces or security forces will be a combination of self-sustainment by the troop contributing nations and emphasizes on host nation provision to facilitate rapid reception, staging, and onward movement where available. These units will be self-sustained until the Joint Logistic Support Group and national support elements are operational. National support elements. Units from national support elements that has task to support national forces during the reception, staging, and onward movement process will deploy with fully self-sustained logistic capacity. If needed, these units will be supported by host nations until own national support elements is operational. The follow-on units inside the national support elements can go through the reception, staging, and onward movement process similar to the tactical units before they start solving their tasks. We have in this presentation introduced you to the NATO reception, staging, and onward movement process. Key takeaway: the reception, staging, and onward movement process is an operation that are planned by the Joint Task Force and executed by Joint Logistic Support Group. Thank you for following this presentation.